Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're going to dive right into the massive gap between our global hydrogen ambitions and actual on-the-ground project execution. For the past decade, hydrogen has been championed as this ultimate game changer for industrial decarbonization. But as we're going to see today, we are at an absolute crossroads right now. And honestly, global food and energy markets are completely hanging in the balance. So here's our roadmap for today's deep dive. We'll start with the hydrogen ambition gap, move into energy and food security, unpack the circular investment problem, detail the 5 essential policy steps, and finally talk about moving from ambition to execution. All right, let's jump into Section 1, the hydrogen ambition gap and setting the baseline for global demand. To really wrap our heads around the scale of the challenge here, we first need to look at where the global hydrogen industry stood in 2025. We were looking at over 100 million tons of demand. This is not some new niche startup market, right? This is a massive existing industrial engine. But here's the catch. Despite all the hype, 99% of that colossal demand is still met by unabated fossil fuels. Low emissions hydrogen? It accounted for only about 1% of global production. So the real challenge isn't proving that we can produce green hydrogen. It's about replacing an already massive, entrenched global footprint. And this brings us to a really visceral contrast between political talk and market reality. On one hand, governments are throwing around a target of 27 million tons by 2030. But on the other hand, the projects that have actually reached final investment decision, or FID, represent a mere 4 million tons. That right there is the ambition gap. Without FID, a project is literally just a PR announcement on a piece of paper. If these projects don't lock in financing by early 2027, up to 22 million tons of potential capacity might just completely vanish. To close this gap by the end of the decade, the hydrogen sector needs a 100% annual growth rate. And let me be clear, that is historically unprecedented. Just look at the historical numbers for a second. At their absolute peaks, nuclear energy grew at 25% annually. Liquefied natural gas hit 35%. Even the massive solar and wind boom peaked around 38%. We are asking the global hydrogen sector to pull off something no major energy transition in human history has ever done, doubling its entire capacity year over year. Moving on to Section 2, Energy and Food Security, the geopolitical stakes. You know, the strategic conversation around hydrogen isn't just a purely environmental issue anymore. It's a hard geopolitical vulnerability. Why? Because hydrogen is rarely traded in its pure form. Instead, it's deeply embedded in global systems through these strategically vital derivatives. You can't just easily pipe raw hydrogen across an ocean. So the global economy operates through derivative commodities. Ammonia gives us fertilizer and maritime fuels. Urea is literally the world's most widely used nitrogen fertilizer. Methanol is a core industrial feedstock. So when we talk about hydrogen, we're really talking about the fundamental building blocks of modern civilization. Now, the crucial takeaway here is that a massive percentage of these derivatives are highly concentrated in the Middle East, and that makes global supply chains extremely sensitive to disruptions. The region produces roughly 1/6 of the world's global hydrogen, but look at its absolute grip on international seaborne trade. We're talking nearly 40% of urea, almost 45% of methanol, and half of all sulfur seaborne trade coming from right here. When maritime routes get disrupted, the shockwaves don't just hit energy markets. They slam into farms, factories, and global commodity prices. And this concentration is, quite literally, a global food security crisis waiting to happen. We actually saw this when urea prices doubled between January and May of 2026 due to regional disruptions. Import-reliant nations really felt the squeeze, which, at the end of the day, means higher food prices for you at your local grocery store. I mean, look at India, importing nearly 5 million tons of urea just from the Middle East, or Brazil and Australia, which are completely dependent on imports. For these nations, developing domestic low-emission hydrogen isn't just about scoring a climate win. It is an absolutely vital long-term resilience strategy to protect their food supply. Okay, Section 3, the circular investment problem, diagnosing the bottleneck. So if the stakes are this incredibly high, why aren't we building more low-emission hydrogen projects? We've got the motivation, we've got the technology. Well, the root cause is the offtake problem. An offtake agreement is basically just a promise from a customer to buy the product before the plant is even built. Out of 1.7 million tons of early agreements back in 2025, only 20%, about 340,000 tons, were actually firm commitments. Put simply, nobody is signing on the dotted line, and producers just cannot reach that crucial final investment decision without predictable locked-in revenue.
This massive lack of secure customers kicks off a highly frustrating circular bottleneck in the industry. It's like a trap. Step one of this trap: production requires demand. You simply can't walk into a bank and secure a multi-billion-dollar loan to build a massive electrolysis plant unless you can show them exactly who is buying your hydrogen for the next 10 to 15 years. But here's step two. Demand naturally requires competitive prices. An ammonia producer or a steel manufacturer operates on razor-thin margins. They will not, and honestly often cannot, volunteer to pay a massive green premium over cheap, conventional fossil fuels just for the sake of being sustainable.
Which leads us to step three. We can't drive down those green premiums to achieve competitive prices without massive operational scale. It's exactly what we learned from the solar and wind industries, right? Costs only crash when manufacturing and deployment scale up. You absolutely need gigawatt-scale projects to unlock those economies of scale. And finally, the trap snaps shut, because you cannot scale up electrolyzers and supply chains without the pipelines, the storage, and the port infrastructure already being in place. And guess what? That infrastructure requires committed production and consumption to get built in the first place. So we are stuck in this absurd, paralyzing loop. So how do we fix it? That brings us to section 4. 5 essential policy steps, the required market solutions. Breaking this paralyzing cycle is the ultimate challenge here, and it's really the core roadmap of today's explainer. The era of governments just announcing sky-high production targets and hoping for the best, that's over. Here are the 5 essential policy steps required to transform hydrogen production into reliable market demand. 1. Realign our targets with actual market reality. 2. Actively create the demand through binding policy. 3. Funnel public support exclusively to projects that are fully ready for construction. 4. Accelerate the physical infrastructure. And 5. Strengthen partnerships with emerging economies to build true global resilience. Let's zoom in on step 2 for a second. Governments really have to step up and enforce demand-side policies, things like green standards and quotas, to give producers that long-term certainty they desperately need. This is exactly how you solve the offtake problem. If a government mandates the use of low-carbon fertilizer or implements carbon contracts for difference, which basically bridges the cost gap between green and gray hydrogen for consumers, suddenly the demand isn't just theoretical anymore. It is guaranteed by policy. And guaranteed demand is exactly what makes a project bankable. And looking at step 5, international partnerships in regions like Africa have to focus on local value creation, not just treating them as export hubs. Africa possesses this enormous renewable potential, yet as of our baseline, only 1 of 31 projects there had reached final investment. Meanwhile, 600 million people there still lack basic electricity. High financing costs and currency risks are massive barriers. Meaningful policy means we need to use blended finance to build local fertilizer production, green iron, and true domestic industrial capacity, rather than just extracting green energy. Finally, section 5, from ambition to execution, the final assessment. As we wrap up this explainer and look to the next decade, the why is basically solved. We know hydrogen can strengthen energy security, reduce our exposure to volatile fossil fuel prices, and decarbonize heavy industry. Now, we just have to solve the how. The technology is already proven. The success of this next phase relies entirely on flawless industrial execution across these 5 critical conversions. You need the renewable electricity. You have to convert that to reliable production. You turn that into guaranteed demand. You lock that into bankable projects. You connect it with physical infrastructure. And ultimately, you establish an ecosystem that can actually survive geopolitical shocks. So I want to leave you with this final thought. The market opportunity here is absolutely enormous. But are we truly prepared to prioritize hard execution over flashy ambition? Because the countries, the companies, and the investors that can actually solve this complex puzzle of cost, infrastructure, and financing, they're the ones who are going to shape the next industrial era. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer,